And in boxing, you got the same thing. You have boxers, and then you have punchers, and then you have guys like Ezzard Charles, who was a boxer and a puncher. And then you have guys like Joe Louis, a boxer and a puncher. And then if the guy can take a punch, if you got a good jaw structure, you got a jaw like a Mack truck, where you not only can box when you have to, and then when the guy's in trouble, or you can really punch and get him out of there, and you're going to get hit once in a while. Now, if you can take a punch, then you got something. Then you got a complete fighter.
If you live in Cincinnati, you may know the name Ezzard Charles. You may know that he was a boxer, and you probably know him as the namesake for the road that connects I-75 to Music Hall. You may know that his nickname was the Cincinnati Cobra from his mural in Over the Rhine, but you may not know that he was the greatest light heavyweight boxer of all time, and you probably don't know that Ezzard Charles was hated when he was the undisputed heavyweight champion in 1950. We don't really talk about the reasons why he was so great, or even his story. Ezzard read minds in the boxing ring. At his best, he was unpunchable, and at his worst, he was one of your toughest opponents. He was a middleweight who fought heavyweights.
He was just too fast for those guys at heavyweight, which is the advantage that most smaller guys have when they move up against bigger guys, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? So many boxing fans today just think, well, he's a smaller guy, so he's going to get beat up by the bigger, stronger guy. When in many cases, if the skill is there, the smaller guy uses his skill and his speed to his advantage.
That was William Dettloff, author of Ezzard Charles, A Boxing Life. This guy is the first person to really do an in-depth biography about Ezzard Charles. He's the only person to ever do it, which I found impressive. It'd be a lot easier to do another book about Rocky Marciano or Joe Louis, but his biography, precisely because it was difficult to make, precisely because he was the first person to do that biography, it offers a significant historical value.
What I knew about Ez is he was really a clean-cut guy. He lived with his grandma. And most of the people that met him really liked him. He wasn't a show-off, yet he was good,
That's Frank Wettencamp. He is one of the people you're going to meet who actually knew Ezzard Charles. Ezzard was a gentleman. He defied expectations. Cincinnati fans even booed him when he won a unanimous decision over Teddy Rose in Music Hall Arena, when he was just showing mercy to the washed-up middleweight in later rounds. He knew he'd already won, because Ezzard wasn't trying to look pretty or put his all in one punch. He just wanted to win. There was a time in America when boxing was more important than football is today. When Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling for the title in 1938, 70 million people listened to that broadcast on radio. It was like the Super Bowl multiplied by 2. And yeah, today a big heavyweight fight, Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury, that gets some attention, but even those kind of feel like a blip on the cultural radar.
Didn't have TV back in those days, so it was all radio. If you listened to any of the heavyweight fights, I'd listen to all the Joe Louis's fights. They always were on the radio. Boxing was big.
They had an arena. When my dad fought, they had an arena on Central Parkway. It was called the Parkway Arena. And every Wednesday they had wrestling, and then every Friday night they had fights once a week. In fact, a lot of the guys that Georgie Smith gave me, they used to fight every week, and they would change their name so that people wouldn't get tired of seeing the same fighter.
The reasons Ezzard's story was swept aside is complex. It's a mixture of timing, race, style, and personality. He belongs to the club of boxers who were almost cultural forces, but in this podcast we're going to look at why Ezzard Charles is worth paying attention to, why he is the peak of masculinity, why his story deserves to be monitored a little bit more closely, and why you should pay attention to him. This episode is part 1 of a 5-part series. My name's Ricky Mulvey. In this show, we're going to go over Charles's early career when he went from the son of a sharecropper to a top contender. Lawrenceville, Georgia had one doctor who cared for black people in 1920. Webster Pierce Ezzard, Dr. Ezzard. And Ezzard's parents didn't have any money to pay the good doc to birth him, So they made the doctor's last name their son's first name. Ezzard wasn't the only Ezzard running around Lawrenceville, Georgia in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. He didn't learn to read until he was 10 years old, and it's only because he was sent up here to live with his grandmother and great-grandmother. His mother tried the best she could. His father was largely absent, but he didn't start going to school until he was 10. So he had no education in the South, so that didn't really figure into any aspect of his life as a student.
That's Kevin Grace, the author of Cincinnati Boxing and an archivist at the University of Cincinnati. Ezzard did not have an easy childhood in Georgia. Dad was in and out of the house, and his mom was trying to make ends meet. The California author and playwright Bud Bugzowski was kind enough to share a letter with me that Ezzard's paternal aunt, Miss Bonnie Kate Reese, wrote to him in 1975. The following has been edited for length and clarity. Lawrenceville, Georgia, 167 Branson Street, July 17th, 1975. As Ezzard grew older, his mother would leave him with her mother because she worked every day. Sometime later, he began living with his grandmother because she had children to play with. I could not think of all the kids he played with at the time. His best pal, name was Leroy Witherspoon. All the children Charles played with died out, and others left home at an early age. By the time he was 6 years old, his great-grandmother was keeping him. She would take him to work with her every day, and his play pal was White. Those kids ran all over town. They are all dead now. Ezzard's mother had a baby girl, and she lived about 3 months. My brother lived with Charles' mother about a year and a half. My brother's name is Willie Charles. I'm going to tell you a truth about this small town. That was a made marriage. Things didn't work out too well, so my brother left Georgia to move to Pennsylvania rather than have trouble. He didn't know any of Ezzard's boyhood days, and his mother left him here when he was very small and left him with his grandmother and a great-grandmother. I'm a poor writer, and I wish I could give you more on Charles. All the people that could tell me anything has died out. Miss Bonnie Kate Reese, the aunt of Ezzard Charles. Did Ezzard ever talk to you about his childhood?
No, but I read him the letters, I read him the letters, and he was kind of, shook up a little bit. But, we didn't dwell on it. No, we didn't dwell on it at all.
That's Bud Bugzowski, the California author and playwright. We're going to hear from him a little later on, as he knew Charles primarily when he lived in Chicago in the 1960s. Ezzard spent his summer days fighting. No TVs, not too many radios. What else are you going to do in the Georgia heat? And every summer in Lawrenceville, the old guys in town would rope off a section of dirt as a makeshift boxing ring in the downtown area for the kids to fight in this bizarre game called a battle royale. Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, fought in these battle royales as a kid, and Ezzard did later in the 20th century.
Yeah, there's a long history of battle royales. It's not like it happened only occasionally or during a short period. All fighters, especially black fighters from the South during that era, and not even just the South, by the way, also the North, battle royales were fairly popular as a kind of a sideshow to a regular boxing match, and included on the card would be a bunch of guys who were just blindfolded and swinging at each other in many cases. And it was fairly common. And they were put together by, regular boxing promoters. Now, I'm sure there wasn't a boxing promoter per se putting them together in Gainesville when Ezzard was 10 or 11 years old, but that would be just somebody in the neighborhood, just for entertainment. Yeah. A bunch of kids would get together and just pummel each other in a ring and blindfold them in some cases. And that was Ezzard's first exposure to having gloves on and fighting guys. It was a very common practice, especially in the South, but also in other parts of the country.
Ezzard quickly understood that knocking around kids his own age was the first step to really being rich and famous. Because if you were a black kid in Georgia or anywhere in the United States, boxing was the only sport where black people competed against white people on a somewhat regular basis.
Like I say, boxing was another family to everybody that boxed. You had your biological family, and then you had your boxing family. And race wasn't a factor. I mean, blacks always were in boxing right from the get-go. That wasn't biased. And the Irish, they were kind of ostracized by society. When they came over here, they were the low class. They were active in boxing. Italians, the same thing. We were low class, coming here from third world and taking them jobs that nobody else wanted. And so actually back in the day, the Jews, the same way. The Jews, the Irish, the Italian, and the blacks. That's what made up boxing.
That's Buddy LaRosa. He is one of the most colorful guests that you're going to hear in this series. You also heard him to start off the episode. This man is the American dream. He went from being the son of an immigrant to going to World War II and fighting for the United States, coming back, and then starting a restaurant that became more than 60 locations today. He also, as a side note, as if that wasn't enough, had a hand in training, managing, or being a part of every boxer, every champion boxer from Cincinnati for the past 5 decades.
Boxing was very racist then, okay? There's no question about that. But of all the major sports, it was clearly the least racist. There were guys, professional black boxers fighting the professional white guys way before basketball, for example, was integrated, or baseball, or football.
Boxing was always a popular sport for those who had to adapt to live. Again, here's Buddy LaRosa.
And then if you were Irish and if you were Jewish or Italian and you went into the pros, many of them changed their name. Like some people, when they go into show business, they have a stage name. Well, some of them fought under different names because promoters might have been a little prejudiced. They didn't particularly like Jews or didn't like Irish or Italian. So if they were booking fighters out of town, they necessarily didn't say what's his ethnic background. They'd see the name. Well, when my dad fought, he fought under Tony Rose, R-O-S-E.
Prohibition also reigned during Ezzard's childhood. The constitutional ban on the production and sale of alcohol helped give rise to the mob in the United States, and therefore the mob's involvement in boxing. The drinking, the gambling, and the general debauchery proved to be a magnet for gangsters. And when Ez was a preteen, the age he first entered a boxing gym, the Mafia literally bought off the heavyweight championship and gave it to an Italian strongman named Primo Carnera. But that's a story for another time.
When people ask me, how can you tell if somebody was connected to the mob at all during that era, I say, did they have any big fights? And if the answer is yes, they were connected to the mob. As simple as that. You didn't get big fights unless you were owned to some degree, or had some involvement, or were paying some money to the mob. And that includes Ezzard.
Jake LaMotta, the Raging Bull, the Martin Scorsese movie, said in his autobiography, quote, "I also noticed that around the gym all the time there were the mob guys, for the very simple reason that there's always betting on fights, and betting means money, and wherever there's money, there's the mob. If you paste that inside your hat, it will maybe explain a lot of things to you, and maybe even save you some trouble." After Ezzard's dad left, his mom joined the Great Migration up north. She went to New York City and dropped Ezzard off with his grandmother, Maud Foster, in Cincinnati's West End. She decided that New York City was no place to raise a child right. Many black people in unstable sharecropping jobs came to the West End to find work in Cincinnati's slaughterhouses, breweries, and the railroad station at Union Terminal.
So it was everything from poor to working class to middle class African Americans living in the West End. And it was almost a community in and of itself. You know, the stores there that were frequented, the shops, the local businesses, the funeral parlors, the nightclubs, everything like that. It was almost a self-contained community.
That's Kevin Grace. The smell of pork fat and open sewers reeked. When Ezzard was a teenager, the Ohio River's great flood submerged his neighborhood. Cincinnati's attitudes were very different in the early 20th century. Buddy LaRosa remembers selling produce at Findlay Market, which is still a bustling gathering place where you can find vendors selling meat, dairy products, and vegetables.
My dad, he had a couple stands in Findlay Market, and I worked there. I joined the Navy to get away from him, in that business, because after a while there's more to selling bananas, and somebody stole the hand of bananas, then I'd have to run after them and take the bananas away from them. And if they try to, wouldn't give them to me, and then maybe they were bigger than me, then I used my boxing skill, and I'd hit them 2 or 3 times. Then they wouldn't mess with you. Then they got a little respect. But once you're fighting with somebody that is trained, they can throw 5, 6 punches, and you don't know where they came from. And you always finish with one to the head, but to the nose. You try to hit the nose, because that usually takes their spirit away. Then they run, and you bring the bananas back. One day I did that, and the guy's father came back, and he said to my dad, he said, "My son said that you did this to him." He says, "No, my son did. But if you don't get away from here, I'll do it to you." And then he turned around and got the hell. In Findlay Market, they're not too proper. What do you want? What do you want, lady? Out in the suburbs, it's, "Can I help you, please?" "What would you like today, ma'am?" Down in Findlay Market, well, I don't know how it is now. "What do you want, lady?" "Don't touch them tomatoes, lady. I'll get them for you."
Findlay Market is Cincinnati's ethnic and economic mixing pot still, but you may find kinder service today if you go to buy a $10 chocolate bar, sushi-grade tuna, or aged balsamic vinegar. A childhood highlight came when the great Cuban featherweight Kid Chocolate came to Cincinnati. The promoter drove Chocolate around in the West End in an open convertible, hoping that would build excitement for the fight at Music Hall Sports Arena. Charles followed, paying close attention to Kid Chocolate's beautifully tailored suit. Pictures of Jack Johnson, a rising boxing prospect named Joe Louis, and Kid Chocolate were the rare instances where Ezzard would see a person of color dressed in beautifully tailored clothes. One kid ran up to Kid Chocolate's car and asked, "Chocolate, how many suits you got?" "Man," Kid Chocolate said, "I got suits for every day of the year. I got 365. The fight's promoter found Ezzard in the crowd. He asked him and some of Ezzard's friends if they'd set up chairs for the event. They'd get free tickets if they did. Charles jumped at the chance, and he spent hours walking the floor of Music Hall Arena to make sure that every chair was in place on the floor and the balcony. Now, when I say Cincinnati Music Hall, you may be imagining the Springer Auditorium. Music Hall Sports Arena was a very different place.
Well, Music Hall was a major boxing venue. This was before Cincinnati Gardens was built. But even afterwards, it attracted a lot of the top fights. So, it was a smaller arena when you compare it to something like the Gardens, but it was smoke-filled, a lot of cigars. The people who attended were generally a mix of, probably 90% men who were wearing their fedoras and their suits and everything else. But it was a mixture of social class and economic class because boxing was so incredibly popular here in the 1940s and 1950s. So when you had an arena like Music Hall, and, we call it Music Hall, but at that time it was more or less a multi-purpose facility. They had track meets there, they had roller skating, they had dances. It wasn't just for ballet and opera and symphony concerts. It was a little bit of everything. They had trade shows in Music Hall. So the fact that there was a boxing arena there was only natural.
Again, that's Kevin Grace. He is an archivist at the University of Cincinnati, also wrote. On fight night, the tickets and the promoter, though, were nowhere to be seen, and Charles went home and listened to Kid Chocolate's mismatched victory on the radio. But that experience only grew Charles's desire to be a famous boxer. He wanted to wear those slick suits and give money to his family. Ezzard at the time did not look like a heavyweight. He didn't look like the photos you've seen of him. He was a stringy, mild-mannered kid, and he wanted to fight for real. But Grandma Maud kept Ezzard out of trouble, making him read his Bible every day and encouraged a clean Christian life. When Ezzard asked if he could have 50 cents to join a boxing gym, she hesitated, but the next day it gave him the money. She figured that boxing wasn't the most wholesome activity, but it was better than sitting idle after school in between shifts at the clothing store. Ezzard met a small Welshman named Bert Williams. Many of the gyms he first visited kicked him out. Williams later described Ezzard as a skinny, undernourished kid who could barely stand and let alone box. But he showed some spirit, and he let him train in his gym.
Bert happened to be the proprietor, or at least one of the main coaches or trainers in the gym where young Ezzard showed up. And he went up to Bert Williams and he just said, "I want to be a fighter." And Bert Williams looked at him and observed that he was very skinny and undernourished and very shy, which runs counter to what many people's perceptions of fighters are. But Bert Williams is a very respected fight guy in the community. Cincinnati had a very robust and large boxing community. He just became his initial coach, his amateur coach. And Bert Williams has to be credited to some degree, by the way, and he gets none at all, with having taught Ezzard a lot of what he came to use as a fighter, and a very professional one, or a very successful one, I should say.
Ezzard took his fair share of beatings at Williams' gym. The first day, a more experienced amateur knocked him around the ring, and he left bleeding and bruised. But he showed up the next day, and the following one too. Ezzard slowly got better. He stuck and moved. He kept his chin down when he threw his jab and breathed through his nose. He learned the fundamentals that don't come naturally to a person in a street fight.
And some guys are that way in the gym, but then they put them in the ring, and then they forget everything, and they become stage fright, then they can't perform. They call them gym fighters. Gym fighters look like champions in the gym, and then when you put them in the ring, they just freeze up. They just don't ever get out of it.
Bert Williams booked Ezzard for a match at the American Legion Hall in Newport, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati. Today, Ivy runs up and down the building. They hosted bingo on Fridays. But in 1936, the American Legion Hall was humming with fight fans. The room stunk with smoke, and the boxing ring barely fit between the pool tables and the bar. Did Ezzard really have promise in him? Would Ezzard get scared under the bright lights? Would he freeze up when he was hit with a real punch? Was he destined to be a gym fighter?
Everybody is special. Nobody is junk. I'd name them male junk. Everybody's got a skill or a talent. It's up to me as a coach to find that skill or talent. I tell a kid, hey, you're a nice kid. You're working hard, but take up another sport. My dad did the same thing to me. He said, hey, take up another sport. You're not cut out to be a boxer. If you stay in here, you're going to wind up with scrambled eggs for brains.
Ezzard's opponent was Al Jackson, another new kid on the amateur circuit, and he was beatable but not easy. The fight was probably early in the card. The observers, mostly men, mostly gamblers, and mostly smokers, got their drinks and placed their bets. The two amateurs rushed each other. Ezzard threw winging punches and glanced off of Jackson's forearms. Ezzard's opponent bobbed and weaved and hugged inside, slipping under Ezzard's crooked jabs. The lights in the crowd shocked Ezzard, and he forgot his fundamentals in the first round. They started fighting in a phone booth, punching through the cigarette smoke, refusing to step backward, and grabbing on for dear life when they got tired. Midway through round one, though, Jackson popped up from a flurry and stung Ezzard with a left hook. The lights went out and the referee counted.
1, 2, 3.
Al Jackson backpedaled to a neutral corner, and Ezzard's trainer Bert Williams asked himself if Ezzard was destined to be a gym fighter.
6, 7, 8.
The ring lights blurred for Ezzard, but at least the lights were on. Ezzard took a knee on the canvas and got up on the count of 8. Bert shouted over the din. The gamblers who bet $1 or $2 on Jackson elbowed their friends in the crowd. Just survive the round, Ezzard thought. Ezzard kept Jackson at bay with a series of jabs for the remaining minute. In the second round, he came out with a renewed energy against his opponent. He punished Al Jackson with a flurry of hooks and uppercuts. He pushed him against the ropes. He fended off punches with his glove. A sharp hook to the liver put Jackson on the canvas. And Al Jackson, he couldn't get up before the count of 10. Bert Williams had his answer. This kid, Ezzard Charles, was going to be better than a gym fighter. Bert Williams was going to make Ezzard a great boxer, and maybe get a piece of those winnings too.
But suffice to say that Ezzard owed something to Bert Williams for the fighter that he became. And Williams, by the way, became very bitter later on when Ezzard started quote unquote getting into the money, as used to be said when a fighter started getting successful. And I don't really blame him, but I don't know exactly why they split.
After his fight against Jackson, Ezzard went home and looked at his scrapbook of Joe Louis clippings, photos of him smiling and endorsing products, food that Ezzard didn't eat, and medicine that he didn't take. Louis wore suits, he flashed smiles and sat close, but not too close, with white Hollywood actresses. Ezzard saw this as his inspiration. He went on to win 42 straight times in his amateur career, thanks primarily to his tireless work ethic. He steamrolled his early opponents with his signature slashing punches. Even as Charles was a professional fighter and even working shifts at the clothing store, he still attended high school. Today, try to picture a high school kid boxing against serious opponents and then going to school the next day. In a suit. Yep, Ezzard wore a suit to school every day. I mean, he wanted to look good with the purses he picked up, and plus, that's one of the benefits of working at a clothing store.
Well, when he went to school, went to Woodward, his home life made sure that he was well dressed when he went out in the world, that he was clean and neat. But he was also a little older than some of the students, not by a whole lot, but, enough to make a difference. And of course, by the time he was in high school, he was boxing as an amateur. And so building a reputation among the other students as a boxer. And so it was a big deal for kids, especially younger kids, to kind of, be friends with him, mess with him a little bit. And there is that old story to where he put his hands in his pockets and had them throw punches at him, and he ducked every one of them.
That's Kevin Grace. This is Frank Wettencamp. He went to high school with Ezzard Charles, and this is how he remembers him.
I had hurt my leg, and I was a gymnast. So I was trying to build my leg up, and I start running at the track after school. And Ez was running, and there was a fellow. There was 3 boxers who were running. There was Ez and Lloyd Seals and Sylvester Salter. So I ran with them, and we became acquainted, and we had a lot of fun, a lot of laughs together. So Ez, when he would box, he would let me carry a bucket, like as part of his entourage, and then I could get in free.
But that nice kid from Cincinnati would soon learn that the violent delights of boxing also had violent ends. That's the show. Hey, I had a good time making this. Hope you had a good time listening. Please do me a big favor. If you made it this far, just a couple of seconds, leave a 5-star rating, leave a review if you're so inclined. That really, really helps me out, helps other people find this show, and it really only takes a few seconds. On next week's episode, we're going to get a little bit closer to Charles's matchup with the great Joe Louis. We're going to talk about the time Charles killed a man in the ring, how that affects a guy like that, and what it's like to be an almost famous star black boxer in World War II, and a whole lot more. Appreciate you guys hanging out. I'll see you soon.